of Id count? That was one of my favorites.
The Wizard of Id, yeah, definitely.
The Wizard of Id. I went right from The Wizard of Id and BC, which was another funny comic, to Doonesbury. And it just was a big jump. One of them had a lot of reading and writing, and the other one didn't. But I liked The Wizard of Id because it put you into this weird time and place, and probably being, as a future historian I really enjoyed it. It was just so silly. It was absolutely silly. And for a kid, it was wonderful. We used to buy them in those little trade paperback books that cost about $1 at Kmart. Yeah, so we had hundreds of them just all over the house.
So that was Johnny Hart, right?
I believe so, yeah. He may have done both of those.
I was going to say, didn't he do both?
I think he did, yeah. Similar humor. But funny. I mean, he used a lot of puns. He used a lot of satire. It was better than something like Garfield, which was just, a one-off joke kind of thing. I really enjoyed him.
Yeah, I feel like to understand my niece and nephew just in the past year discovered my old Garfield books that I loved as a kid. And I feel like to really understand Garfield, I almost have to go back and read like Wizard of Id and Heathcliff and all the context of the comics page from that time. Right. And then Garfield suddenly seems kind of avant-garde or kind of really different. But looking back on it now, it seems kind of cliche because it's been around, 40 years?
Yeah, I think that's the thing. We're so used to it. One of my kids liked The Family Circle, and I used to wind up having to read, I think, 3 pages of Family Circle jokes every night. And then I would have to sit there and explain it to her because she was like 5 years old. And she's like, so why is that funny? Like, okay, then. And then she'd laugh and she'd go, read it again. And then she'd laugh again. And it was like, okay, this is not how humor works, but okay.
But it is, isn't it?
I guess really it is. Yeah. I always think if you have to explain a joke, it's not a joke. But I guess with comics, sometimes you have to let it sink in a bit.
I think that too, but that's a really good point. I remember being, 8 or 9 and reading Bloom County. And half the time I had no idea the political allusions he was making, the people he was naming, but it was hilarious. I didn't understand it, but I knew it was hilarious. And it wouldn't have been the same to hear a told joke or read it in a paragraph, but to see the artwork with the things I didn't understand was just, I found it hilarious and captivating.
And meanwhile, if I want to do anything about Watergate, I generally go back and read it all in Doonesbury again, because they did the best job. He did the best job of explaining Watergate. And I was a kid at the time, I was like 10 or 11 at the time. So just on the edge of starting to understand things in government and how things were working. I had an older sister who was a political science nut, so she used to always read a lot of Doonesbury. But I've read a lot of Gary Trudeau just to make sense of things. I'm a visual person, so it was very helpful, to put it that way.
Merrick, we now have 17 people in, so if you'd like to repeat your request, maybe they can start popping things into the Q&A.
Sure, yeah. And then we'll give people a minute or two still to arrive in case.
I'm just going to shut my door so that.
Yeah, and Barbara has a little introduction to give as well.
Yeah, so welcome, folks. Sort of unofficial cold start welcome. I was just saying to Laura and Barbara, it's really cool when we're starting these presentations to just kind of go around the room and say, hey, what comics have really meant something to you throughout your life? And like Barbara was just saying, it could be a comic strip, could be a comic book, graphic novel, could be something totally different. And whatever it is about comics that kind of brought you here tonight, I'd be very interested to know. And if you want to enter a title or an artist into the Q&A, which is the little chat-like button down at the bottom here, then we can get a sense of where everyone's coming from tonight. And we'll take a look at that in a few minutes. So you have a few minutes to close your eyes and imagine some comic from long ago or one you were just reading today.
Well, and Barbara, I looked up Family Circle, and it's actually Family Circus.
Family Circle was the ladies' magazine, wasn't it?
Yeah. Right. I believe. But that was one of my favorites. And then a little later, The Far Side.
Far Side.
Wow. So you're that small group of the Venn diagram of Family Circus fans and Far Side fans. There was a tiny little overlap. And you and a couple other people are in there. That's great. I had Family Circus, which was the one always drawn in a circle.
Yeah.
That was my grandmother's favorite. So it's always had sort of this ironically tender spot in my heart, because I remember as a little kid, she would read it to me, read the caption, we'd talk about the picture, just like as a point of connection. But I've also met people who can't stand it, and it's.
I have met so many people who can't stand it. But I liked it as a kid, and like I said, one of my kids really enjoyed it all the time when she was little. Just loved Family Circus, right? She was at the time she was an only child, and she really wanted to be in a larger family. So I think one of the things was that she really enjoyed all the different kids in that family. I was from a large family, so to me it was like, look at that little family. So.
A nice, tidy little couple kids.
Nice, tidy, everything. Yeah.
Well, but I was going to say, even if you can't stand a comic strip, it's often giving you an invitation to like satirize it or take it and turn it in a different way. And I've seen a lot of hilarious satires on Family Circus too.
I bet.
Oh, cool. We are getting some comics in our Q&A here. So as we're pulling in, as we're setting up, feel free to put your favorite comic or a comic that's meant something to you in our Q&A. And we'll have a reading of those as we're starting soon.
So you can see those, correct, Merrick?
I can, yeah. I just glanced down and saw some cool ones in there. You can see what other people are reading. Oh, good. Jackie mentioned one we're going to look at tonight. Good. I won't spoil it. People can check it out, but we'll read them in a moment.
This is taking the conversation in a very different way, but we had a volunteer that dropped off a sketchbook by Phipps, who was the cartoonist for Der Stürmer during World War II. And he also illustrated the poisonous mushroom, which was, all of this helped brainwash Germany, particularly German children, with the poisonous mushroom. And it took a little bit of research to figure out who Phipps was. And our volunteer, Bill Guston, had been stationed in this prison camp, and Phipps had given him this sketchbook. The sketchbook wasn't cartoonish at all. It was just little sketches of camp life. We ended up helping him get it into the Holocaust Museum. So anyway.
Wow, yeah.
Cartoons have sometimes been used for very, very terrible purposes.
I'm going to allude to that as we get started, as I do my little demo. Yeah. So thank you for mentioning that and making an Exeter connection there.
Roundabout, yeah. Well, it's a little after 7. I'm wondering if we should start. So Barbara, do you want to? You're muted.
Bad omen.
Now I'm not muted. Okay, welcome to the Exeter Historical Society's first November virtual program. I'm Barbara Rimkunis, the curator and a co-executive director of the Historical Society. Tonight's program takes place in Misquamscook, now called Exeter, in Nadakina, the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the Alnabak, the people who have stewarded Nadakina and Aki, Nibi, Olaquakak, and Awasak, the land, the waterways, flora, and fauna throughout the generations. I'd like to thank Exeter TV for bringing us this program to you through Zoom. The program is also being presented on our Facebook page and on Channel 98. A quick programming note, due to this pesky pandemic, we've decided not to hold our annual holiday open house for the second year in a row. Instead, we're offering a second program in November. On Tuesday, November 16th at 7 p.m., we'll be back with Joe Radner for a 90-minute workshop via Zoom about family stories, how and why to tell them. Because of the participatory nature of this program, it will not be broadcast on Channel 98 or streamed on Facebook, so you'll have to register to attend. We're fortunate that that program, like tonight's program, is sponsored by the New Hampshire Humanities Council. In January, we plan to meet at the Exeter Town Hall and stream the program on Facebook. You can view our schedule of programs on our website and on our Facebook page. After the program tonight, please stick around and fill out the quick survey by the New Hampshire Humanities Council. As for tonight, thank you for joining us for our presentation about comics in world history and cultures by Merrick Bennett. Tonight, Merrick will be answering questions at the end of the program. Laura Martin, our program manager and the other co-executive director, will be monitoring the Q&A dialog box at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to type your questions there. If you're listening on Facebook, you can write your questions in the comments and we'll try to get to those as well. If you're interested in learning more about Exeter's history, visit our website at www.exeterhistory.org. And if you're a member of the Society, we thank you. Now, a brief introduction on tonight's speaker. Merrick Bennett teaches music and comics in New England and the world beyond. He holds an MED in Curriculum and Instruction from Keene State College and is a rostered teaching artist with the New Hampshire State Council on the Arts. His publications include the graphic novel, The Civil War Diary of Freeman Colby, which I'm pretending to hold up now because Laura asked me to bring it and I left it downstairs. Ah, you got it. Okay, good. And the history webcomic, Live Free and Draw. His historical band, The Hardtacks, received a 2016 Best of New Hampshire Award from New Hampshire Magazine. Thank you, Merrick, for coming. The floor is yours, or the screen.
There we go. Thank you, Barbara. That was a wonderful introduction. It's nice to be able to meet with people. Nice to see people coming out tonight. I give this presentation for New Hampshire Humanities in a lot of different places, and I try to vary it up and show different artifacts and different comics every time. But I'm really excited to talk some comics with you tonight and to hear some questions from you and hear what you see through the Q&A at the bottom there, the little button, hear what you see in some of these ancient comics that we're going to look at. But I thought we'd start off, let's test our share screen here. Hopefully you can see this desktop camera here that is right above my desktop, and I have some paper here. And I thought we'd start off with a little doodle session because I am a cartoonist and I like to use cartooning to illustrate what I'm talking about. So for tonight, let's do a quick definition of terms. I'm going to use two terms and they are distinct terms. I'm going to say cartoon several times. I'm going to use this term and we're going to define it right now. And I'm also going to use the word comics. It's right there in the title, Comics in World History and Cultures. So it'd be kind of strange if I didn't mention it tonight. So for tonight, I'm going to use sort of my own take on an industry standard of this definition of this term cartoon. What I mean when I say cartooning is basically this. If I draw myself with the fewest possible details, I can draw pretty quickly and pretty simply. Right? But it doesn't, maybe it suggests me as a person, a human maybe, but not much more. If I want to make this into a cartoonist, I might give them some of the tools of the trade. So here I am with my pen and my paper. Here I am in cartoon form like that. And cartooning is really, that's as simple as it is, as it gets. Cartooning is drawing as simply as possible to get the maximum impact from your ideas. So for instance, if I wanted to draw this as a cartoon, Merrick, but I wanted to make it look different from other cartoons in whatever I'm drawing, I might have to give myself like my glasses, maybe a hat and a beard, say. And there we go. That might be all I add for my cartoon Merrick. Or, you know, if I want to be fancy, I could flesh out the body a little bit. Oh, now it's going to look like Abraham Lincoln, right? So suddenly these cartoons can turn into different things. Now, this would be if I put, you know, the Gettysburg Address in the hands here, suddenly it's not a cartoon of Merrick at all. It's a cartoon of Abraham Lincoln, maybe. So the idea behind a cartoon, it's like you're drawing as little as possible to get as close to the heart of the idea, to like the main idea. And that can be, as Laura, you just hinted at, that can be a powerful tool for communicating. It can also be a powerful, dangerous tool for stereotyping. And we'll see some examples of that possibly tonight. But that's what I mean when I talk about cartoons. And there is actually a history to that. If we want to get into the history of these terms, there's a wonderful story of how that word came into the English language. And I'm happy to get into that a little later in the Q&A at the end. And then comics. Let's say I'm drawing a picture here and I'm drawing, maybe I'll draw a little cartoon person and they're walking. Oh, and they're carrying an ice cream cone, let's say. All right, pretty clearly a cartoon. And I'll draw another person over here and their arms are up and they're looking worried, as cartoons can, and there's an ice cream cone on the ground. Well, this is a cartoon still, but it's not a comic yet. It's a single picture and it might have a story to it, and it's using cartooning principles, drawing as simply as possible to get the idea across. Maybe it's somebody bringing a spare ice cream cone to their friend who dropped one. It becomes a comic if I have some way to say, dear reader, read this idea and then read that idea, right? So depending on your, now this is key, there's a sense of order, of reading order, of direction in this. Depending on your reading direction, if you read left to right, as an English language reader might, you read somebody walking with an ice cream cone. Oh no, and they dropped their ice cream cone. We get 2 moments in the story, right? If you read right to left as like an Arabic reader or a Japanese language reader might, oh, there's somebody there, they find an ice cream cone on the ground and they pick it up and walk off with it. Totally different story, right? So there's a sense of sequence is the key here, of one thing following another to make the story. Really, it's one or more pictures strung in sequence in some way. That's what I'll mean when I say comics tonight. And as you'll see, I can kind of, that's a huge definition that we can kind of play with and get to look at a whole lot of artwork that might fit that definition of one or more images in sequence in some way. All right, so that's the demo. Just so you know where I'm coming from, like I said, I'm a cartoonist. I draw Civil War history graphic novels. I also draw travel sketchbooks where I just fill a sketchbook with the people I meet and the places I go and then put it all together. I've also been, since we mentioned working with family stories already, I'm psyched that you're going to have Joe Radner come. I love Joe's presentations. I've also been lucky enough to work on a couple graphic novel projects that include family stories from Vermont Folklife Center, working with the oral history of Daisy Turner up in Vermont, and working with pairing cartoonists with undocumented migrant laborers in the Vermont dairy industry and turning their stories into comics ethnography. So that's the kind of work that I do with my comics. And I also teach a lot of groups about principles like this, cartooning and comics. So let's dive into the slides. I'm going to stop this screen share and call up my artwork. All right. Laura and Barbara, I hope, let me know if there are any issues here. I'm assuming you can see the slide, comics and world history and cultures. Now, before I get into this, I did say that we would take a look at the Q&A. So let's take a quick look at some of the comics people mentioned. And you can scroll through the Q&A and see what people have been reading over their lives. We have some Archie comics, New Hampshire, definitely a New Hampshire native comics production, right out of Meredith for many years. Prince Valiant, great. Yeah, Prince Valiant is still being drawn. We have a few people reading Calvin and Hobbes. Jackie mentioned the Bayou Tapestry, and Jackie, we're going to look at that tonight. We have some Calvin and Hobbes and Doonesbury and Peanuts and Bloom County comic strip readers. I grew up reading those. Golden age in the 1980s. And The Far Side, definitely The Far Side. Great. And then some more recent artists, Jeff Danziger, Tom Tomorrow. Yeah, great. And Mandrake the Magician and the Phantom, those are older comics, I believe, but I'm going to have to look up a couple of those artists that people have mentioned. Wonderful. So as I'm showing, I'm going to show a bunch of comics from world history and cultures. Feel free to put your questions. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to put them in that Q&A. And Laura and Barbara will keep an eye on it. And if you're watching us through Facebook, feel free to put it into the comments and we'll try to catch it. And they might interrupt me and ask your question for you as we go. I'm also prepared. I have a little index card here. I'm very prepared tonight to say, good question. I don't know. And I will look up some answers or some examples and get back to you with it. And I'll post it on my site. Because I'm, like I said, a cartoonist. I'm not an art historian. I'm not an anthropologist. So I come at this as a cartoonist. I'm going to look at it kind of technically and as a lover of comics and a reader of world comics. So let's see what we find here. I want to say thank you to New Hampshire Humanities, a wonderful program sponsor. I've been in their roster for years, and I love having the opportunity to visit New Hampshire towns and talk comics with people. Here I am at my desk working on things with my erstwhile assistant Greta there. And here I am in rabbit cartoon form. So this is actually, I'm not sure which of these is more accurate, whether I look like this or I feel like this. Cartooning in some way helps us express a lot about who we are as human beings, I think. I used to always start off by defining comics using Scott McCloud's graphic novel, Understanding Comics, The Invisible Art. I'll start off with a strong recommendation of this book. It's a wonderful starting place if you're interested in comics and comics, how they work, but reading comics to understand that. And on his pages, Scott McCloud defines comics as juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence. So this is not the most exciting artwork in the book. This is his working out his little definition. And then he uses, based on that definition, juxtaposed pictorial and other images, including text, in deliberate sequence. Well, you know, if you have that broad a definition of comics, then really aren't we all obliged to read comics, required by law to read comics anytime we get in an airplane and are going to fly through the skies? Sure, we're supposed to at least. And then if you look at the ways images have been used to tell stories in history, you might find some surprising places where this thing we call comics in English really isn't comical at all, but is definitely juxtaposed images in deliberate sequence, often with a sense of narrative to them. This is a page from some ledger art from Kiowa artwork called the Buffalo Wallow Battle. It's from 1874, and it's definitely meant to be read with a sense of narrative going on here. There's discrete events and there's a story being told. We have to figure out what the rules are of these comics. And that's going to happen all through tonight. I'll show you a bunch of different comics and we'll look at what the reading rules are and why. Because it's my theory, it's an idea I like to play with, that the way we make our comics tells a lot about how we think of the world, how we are cultured, right? So when I was a kid, around age 7 or 8, I got my hands on a copy of Captain Carrot and His Amazing Zoo Crew from my cousin, my older cousin. And I didn't know what it was all about. I didn't know the references, but I loved it. It's a funny animal comic book by DC. This is 1982, 1983. And Superman actually was in the first issue. So there's a tie-in from a more famous character. And I'm going to put a page from Captain Carrot and His Amazing Zoo Crew, kind of a stock mainstream superhero comic, although a satire of a superhero comic. I'll put it alongside a comic made around the same time in Japan, from Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind by Hayao Miyazaki. And I just want to quickly look at these two pages and see how different they are. They're both print comic books from about 1982. But if we open up to a page, I chose these pages for a reason. On the left, we have the Western American superhero comic where look at the word count there. We're not going to read the whole page here, but there's got to be over 100 words on this page. This page will take several minutes to read, even though it's a super jetliner flashing past us in a matter of seconds, right? The page will take minutes to read. And also notice how that jetliner is moving past us. We're standing stationary and that plane is blurring past us. Interesting use of motion in this comic, reading panel by panel. Now on the right, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, a totally different genre, a totally different audience, of course. Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind also uses motion, but in a really different way. This is going to read, again, I shouldn't assume everybody reads comics. Let me go back, and on the Superman comic, we're going to start at the upper left. We'll read the words. We'll look at the pictures. Notice Superman's pointing into the next panel. So we're kind of guided by the artist into that second panel on the upper right. Then we'll drop down into the middle of the page. Then we'll keep dropping down and we're reading the words and connecting them with the images. We'll keep dropping down, read from left to right, always left to right, top to bottom. In a Japanese comic, like I said before, Japanese language readers will read right to left. So this actually starts off here where the glider lifts off the ground, the engine ignites, and the glider takes off right to left. Whoosh. And what happened? The ground isn't even drawn there, right? The ground blurs away, and then we drop down to the next two panels. And this is totally different from that plane. That jetliner was blurring past us. Here, we're moving with the glider and the ground is blurring past us. So there's a totally different approach to like kinetic movement in here. And there's really only 3 or 4 words tops, 5 words tops in that whole page, right? So even though these are both comics being drawn around the same time on opposite sides of the world, into similar sized pages, et cetera, using ink on paper, they're a really different approach to structuring time and space. So why is that? So tonight we'll look at a couple precursors to each of these and try to follow some of the threads of the cultures, the visual cultures that led to these two really different approaches to comics on different sides of the world. I like to remind people, of course, that visual arts, we have visual arts going back over 40,000 years. This is the Sulawesi hunting scene. It's rock painting from an island in Indonesia. They think about 44,000 years old. And I like to point out that often these hunting scenes they always involve animals. Sometimes they involve people. These Sulawesi scenes are fascinating to me as an animal cartoonist because it's a little hard to see, but the little cartoon silhouettes of the hunters actually have ears and horns. Some have tails, some have snouts. They are anthropomorphic animals that can hold tools and that hunt larger, complete animals, fully animal animals. So I draw myself as a bunny rabbit. Maybe that's an ancient approach to representing the human form. Give it animal qualities, give it superpowers, and show it on an adventure. Cartooning, maybe. Comics, probably not. Although some of these cave paintings, like this from the Chevet Caves in France, about 30 or 35,000 years old, I think. Some of these cave paintings, to my eye at least, almost look like animations. They almost look like through repetition, they're trying to establish motion or maybe narrative in some way, or maybe just a tally of animals. Werner Herzog made a wonderful film about the Chevet Caves. It's called In the Cave of Forgotten Dreams. And one of the things he points out is look at the stylistic differences used on these cave walls. You have cave lions that are incredibly realistic, and you have cave lions that are kind of like dopey cartoon caricatures of cave lions. So of course, these were painted over thousands of years on these caves. So you have lots of different artists involved in them. There's another example of stylistic contrast. But you have a lot of different approaches to capturing forms in, dare I say, cartooning styles. This looks to me like drawing as simply as possible to get the maximum idea into the picture. But we may never know. One of the things I like to point out with these caves too is they've done acoustic sampling in a lot of these caves, and the places where there are the most paintings on the walls are also the places with the longest echoes, the most reverberations, the most overtones in the reverberations. So they think that music may have been involved with the worship or narrative or performance or whatever it was around this artwork. So music also has a connection, maybe to an ancient connection to some of these visual arts. All right, jumping forward only about 30,000 years or so, in ancient Egypt, we get what really, to my eye, look like some of the earliest comics narratives. They often read left to right, sort of scrolling, not scrolling, sort of going river-like, zigzagging up the wall, right? So this comic is from a wall painting showing the production of wheat. So we see cultivation of wheat down at the bottom. We see the harvest in the middle. We see the threshing and the delivery to some kind of noble up above. And all through, there are all these tiny little side stories, like the kids fighting over the gleanings, or maybe those are enslaved people fighting over the gleanings, the dropped bits of wheat in the corners. So we get a lot of slices of life, a lot of ideas that are not represented in the writings of the time, because the artists could encode stories a little differently here. If you want to learn how to wrestle in the ancient Egyptian style, here you go. Step by step, shows you all the moves. So there's a lot of ancient comics on these monumental walls, painted onto the walls, that give us not just a sense of what things looked like, but how they changed and how they progressed and what sequence they took. And that, to my eye, to our earliest definition here, is images and other visual forms juxtaposed in deliberate sequence, right? That it's right there on the wall. So let me jump forward a couple thousand years now, and we'll look at our first ancient Roman piece. Might be our only ancient Roman piece tonight, actually. I want to visit briefly with Trajan's Column in Rome. So this is about 2,000 years old. It was completed in the year 113. And it was made to commemorate, this is actually a photograph from around 1896 of what it looked like. So it's a little hard to see how this comic works, but this does capture the mass and the weight of this triumphal column. So this was built right after the Dacian Wars. The Emperor Trajan needed some way to get the message out about how great the emperor was and what a victory he had, what a mission accomplished he'd had out in Eastern Europe in the Dacian Wars. So he commissions this column, and this modern picture is maybe a little better. It's built out of, I think, about 20 solid blocks of marble that are laid on top of each other. There's actually a staircase spiraling up through the inside. It's that large. So you can enter through the bottom, and those are little windows in the side going up the side. And along the outside is the comic. This is the part I'm really interested in, and you can see it. It's relief carvings, and it scrolls up. The column itself is about 100 feet high. The story, I believe, is about 600 feet long if you could stretch it out flat. And it tells the complete story from the emperor's point of view of the Dacian Wars, right? So this is imperial propaganda. It is not the kind of comic you would doodle as a school child looking to make a silly picture of your teacher or something. This is the kind of comic that the emperor puts out because the emperor wants to get a message out. So of course, it shows the Roman legions in one light and the Dacians in another light. One thing I'll show you from this, we obviously won't read the whole thing, but there are websites that break it down scene by scene and analyze what each scene is showing you. I like to point out that this column is right next to the Latin library, where the Emperor Trajan wrote down everything that happened in the Dacian Wars and had the official account there in the library. Go check it out. You can read it on scrolls. It's all there. But that wasn't enough. not everybody was going to go into that library and read the emperor's account. But on your way into the library, everybody was going to see this column, right? And they were going to walk by, and one of the very first scenes at the very bottom, I don't know how they were expected to read the top. I don't think they were. But at one of the very first scenes, as the Roman legions are leaving the gate here and they're crossing the Danube to go fight the Dacians in Eastern Europe, this Roman soldier looks down, and who's supporting that pontoon bridge but the river spirit of the Danube himself? And he is giving his blessing to these Roman legions. Go get them, boys. Let me hold your pontoon bridge up for you, which wasn't always how rivers reacted to being crossed in ancient Rome, right? So right here, we're seeing this established, even with this glance of this legionary looking back at the river spirit. Their eyes lock, and they're off on this holy war supported by the supernatural powers, right? It's an intense way to establish that you're going to see the true emperor's story of the Dacian Wars here. And there are some horrific scenes in here. And it really teaches you a lot about what it meant to be a roving Roman army in enemy territory. Two things that really blow my mind with this. I've been telling people for years, consider that this kind of comic, consider how much work it takes to carve versus just doodling on paper, for instance. But also, a lot of these soldiers seem to have empty hands. They should be carrying weapons, but their hands are empty. That's because I'm told a lot of the weapons were actually added in as iron weapons sticking out of the column, which is a whole other layer of three-dimensionality to your comics, right? When you have actual pointed iron spears and swords sticking out of your comic. Another reference I just recently came across is that people who have been doing microscopic analysis of this column, which is tragically damaged by pollution in Rome now, they've done microscopic analysis of the surface, and they think it used to be painted colors. Whoa, step back and just imagine this in full color, painted all the way up to the top, right? Or if not full color, bright colors. That, to me, that would be worth seeing if we had a time machine. All right. Any questions so far about cave paintings and ancient Roman triumphal monumental comics? We're going to move now 1,000 years into the future towards the year 1066. And Laura and Barbara will interrupt me, I'm sure, if we get some questions about any of this.
Yeah, we don't have any at the moment, but okay. I'll let you know.
All right, so I want to jump 1,000 years into the future, the Bayou Tapestry now. And I think Jackie mentioned this, I think, in the Q&A as one of your favorite comics. And this is one of my favorite comics, too. This is an incredible piece of artwork. Andrew Bridgeford wrote a book about this tapestry, which is, yes, technically an embroidery, but we always call it a tapestry, I guess. Andrew Bridgeford wrote a wonderful book called, I believe, 1066, in which he points out all the people, most of the buildings, the castles, fortifications, all the things you see in this comic have long since passed away, and yet this linen remains. 1,000 years later, we can read the linen and get the story. So what is the Bayou Tapestry? Well, if you go up into northern France, there's a little town called Bayou, and this is an embroidered tapestry that was kept in the cathedral there for years and years. Whoops, let me try to zoom in on that a little more. There we go. That's all it's going to let me do, I guess. So the tapestry itself is 200 plus feet long. I believe they think it's incomplete. They think there may be a whole other section that was removed for maybe political reasons. But it basically tells the story of the Norman conquest of England, right? And it starts with the backstory where Edward, here on the far left, we see Edward Rex, Edward the King, Edward the Confessor. And he sends Harold Godwinson, one of the wealthiest men in England, off on a mission. And so the tapestry picks up there. Harold Godwinson parties with his men at the pub, and then they get in their boats and they cross the English Channel. And just as they land on the far shore, oh, look, he's apprehended by Guy, Duke Guy, or Count Guy, and he's taken prisoner. And then he's made to grovel in front of Guy, who says, why are you invading my lands? And then some knights show up at the back door saying, we're from William, not yet the conqueror, and we demand the prisoner. And so the adventure goes, right? And it's sort of a swashbuckling adventure until you get to the second or third reel, when Harold Godwinson double crosses William, and William says, that does it. And he comes across the English Channel and actually invades England. And that's why English is not a Germanic language, but it has all this French mixed in and so on. Changes history, right? We have front row seats watching the story come together here. And again, I highly recommend Andrew Bridgeford's 1066, a wonderful account of not just the story in the tapestry. If I jump forward now to some of the battle scenes, you can see those. Here's some battle scenes. This is from the Battle of Hastings. It's not just the account of the story in the tapestry, but it's also the account of how this tapestry still exists, which is not a given, which is quite an adventure story itself. Did you have a comment, Laura?
Yes, we have a comment and a question. The comment by Stacy Penna is that she saw it in person, and it's amazing, very long. And then she also said, is social media our new historical cartoons? We decide what is posted like the Roman column.
Mm-hmm. I like to point out that's a wonderful question that I could not begin to answer, but I do like to point out, when you look at a lot of comics in the ancient world, they read bottom to top. Obviously not the Bayou Tapestry, but that column and the next comic we're going to look at, they read bottom to top, bottom to top. And to a page reader who's used to opening a book and reading top to bottom, that seems kind of strange. And yet when we look at a website, we have no trouble thinking, well, the earliest stuff is at the bottom and the most recent stuff is at the top. So that's bottom to top, chronologically at least. So yeah, I think there are ways that a lot of these ancient comics anticipate what we think are novelties now. And there are ways that we can learn from them about how to read all the stuff around us. I don't know, some people say there's nothing new under the sun. If you turn on the news nowadays, you're going to probably see like people talking, telling a story, and then you might see a little chyron going across the bottom of the screen, right? And it'll say it's something totally different from what they're talking about. Well, look at the Bayou Tapestry. You have the story happening in the middle, and then you have these decorative animals above and below. But at key points in the story, like when these horsemen, these Norman horsemen, come running around and they attack the English, the dead English soldiers fall down into the bottom margin there, and they become the decorations. So we're able to look at a couple parts of the scene at once. We have the combat going on in the main part, and in the bottom, we have the effects of it. And we have people actually raiding the dead and stealing their armor. And then at a certain key point, there's this point in the battle where the archers, the Norman archers, sneaked around a hill and attacked the English. And you're seeing it right now. We split screen. So we have I believe that's William. Yep. That's William saying, here I am, I'm still alive, keep charging my men. Meanwhile, the archers are sneaking around behind them and firing back up into the scene. And that's just a wonderful split screen where we're actually meant to read this and see multiple stories going on at once and follow them both and keep them both straight in our heads. That's pretty advanced reading techniques that I never expected to find in a 1,000-year-old comic, right? So maybe these have something to teach us too about how to read as we scroll quickly through social media or websites and see multiple things at once and try to keep them all straight in our heads. Also, there's hidden narratives worked into this. We won't get into that tonight, but there are missing pieces of this, and there are hidden narratives that nobody's really sure what they mean, but there are codes worked into the story. That is sort of a disinformation campaign that scholars are trying to figure out.
We have another question about this piece. Did women make it? Was it made by women?
That, as far as I know, that's not been proven. The theory is it was made either by nuns or by monks, probably in the 1070s, about 10 years after the events depicted. And they think that Bishop Odo, who was William's half-brother, commissioned it as a gift, possibly. But then Odo, the bishop, was out of favor. I believe that's Odo right there, giving William good advice in his castle before the battle. And then Odo is also shown on the battlefield, bravely directing men. But I don't think it's been proven that Odo was anywhere near the battle at the time. So this could be a really flattering gift. Again, it's like Trajan's column, it's going to be propaganda. It could be a really flattering gift that makes William look really heroic. And it also introduces Odo's view of things and makes Odo look really heroic, because at the time this came out, 10 years after the battle, Odo was kind of on the outs, and he had gotten into some trouble for some shenanigans the bishop had. But like I say, Andrew Bridgeford breaks all this down and provides some theories on it. But there are a lot of stories behind this seemingly simple left to right story. And there's some wonderful storytelling techniques in the left to right scroll that that we can come back to later if we have time, because we have been in Europe for so long here. I want to get to some other continents. I just want to point out my favorite New Yorker cover of all time. Just after D-Day, the New Yorker publishes this cover by Ree Irvin. And it takes what you just saw on the Bayou Tapestry and inverts it. So the instead of the Normans crossing over and invading England, it is the English crossing over and invading the very place that William the Conqueror left from, right? Wonderful satire, use of art history, commenting on current events, comics. I'll just point out the stained glass windows in so many countless European cathedrals. Often read bottom to top and go panel by panel, literally. And there's countless stained glass window comics all around the cathedrals of Europe. I also should point out, we'll jump to a couple other continents here. The ancient Maya had a system of writing and a system of mathematics that I just love, because they look like such great cartooning / video game art. The way they compose their writing was often based on glyphs. So you would compose these squares, and each little blobby component in that glyph represents either a syllable or a sound or a number. You can actually see in this square on the right-hand column, halfway down, you can see the number 8, that line, and then 3 dots above it, right? The line is 5, the 3 dots are 3. That's the number 8. And they had this amazing, this powerful calculating system. They didn't have decimal numbers. They had, hexadecimal, vegadecimal, sometimes base 20 instead of base 10, sometimes base 18. And they could do these wonderful calculations with them. And when you look at their libraries, well, I'm sorry, we can't look at their libraries because through the colonial process, the Spanish burnt most of their libraries, but a few scraps remain of the ancient Maya, classical Maya library system. There are these wonderful folded codices on fig bark, and they're painted, and they often have calendrical information. Lists of weeks and moons and dry seasons and rainy seasons, and they have the names of people and when they were born, and different dates and records. And these are really guides for the priests that show how to keep a culture and a people alive, a civilized people alive in a really challenging jungle environment. So you can probably see the numbers in there. And beyond that, I couldn't tell you what this says. The Madrid Codex was found basically in the waste bins of in Europe, in Madrid. But it's believed to be between 500 and 1,000 years old. And it is the ancient Mayan codices have only recently been deciphered and started to be read. But there's a lot there in a culture, really a library system based on these little cartooning figures and sharing important information through your visual narratives. And I find these really inspiring from a design point of view too. Let's see. Oh, another thing I like to point out, at one point in the 1500s, the Viceroy of Mexico sent out word to every community in the Mexican colony that the Spanish king, the Spanish crown, wanted them to draw a map of their community. And they got back from mostly indigenous communities, they got back this wonderful mixture of European style maps and native style concepts of space and the universe, map of a community from 1580. Whoops, that's the only one I have. I'm sorry. There's a whole, NPR posted a whole gallery of these, and I believe my site, I linked to it from my site. So another type of storytelling I like to point out is Chinese landscape scrolls. And these on the surface might look like just a still image. There's no panels. How is this a comic? But I think we're meant to read. When I read these, we read right to left, and often they read right to left. And when I read these, there's definitely a sense of narrative. I'm walking along, I pass the Twin Pines. This is called Twin Pines from 14th century China. I come to the shore, I look out across the water, I gaze at the distant shore, and then I notice a little figure fishing in a boat halfway out and across the lake there. Now, masterful cartooning, right? This is just a couple little brush lines. If we zoom in, a couple little brush lines become a whole mountainside. A little stick figure in a boat becomes a person fishing. Masterful cartooning, also a sense of narrative, a sense of moving from one place to another and discovering something. So while there aren't panel borders like in some of these other comics, there's a continuous flow of narrative. And if I jump to an extreme version in 1770, this is one of my favorite scrolls of all, the Emperor's Inspection Tour of the Suzhou Canal. And it follows the Emperor's barge through the canal at Suzhou. And I can't zoom in anymore on this, but if you zoom in on the original scans, you can, I think you can see it. You can look inside every shop window and see what they're selling and see who's in that shop or that restaurant. You can see every person who's come out to greet the Emperor's barge as it passes along this canal. And this is a 40+ foot silk, painted silk tapestry, right? So definitely a sense of adventure, definitely a sense of arriving from one place to another, juxtaposed pictorial images in deliberate sequence. So there we go. We'll put that alongside the Bayou Tapestry as a type of comics. Now, and I see we're at 7:50, so I want to stop for questions on some of these, but I'll just quickly point out the connection with the Japanese comics, because this, let me see here. So these techniques, the Chinese landscape scroll techniques, also show up somewhat in Japanese woodblock prints, where these, rather than being painted on long scrolls of silk, these would be made with blocks of wood. And Japanese woodblock printers, I believe the name is ukiyo-e, they found ways to, they would make multiple wood blocks, of course, so they could do almost full color prints. And a lot of these date back to the 1700s even. This is before there was full color printing in Europe. I don't know about China, but they achieved such mastery of the form that there were affordable full color posters that working class, middle class Japanese families could afford to buy and put up on the walls of their homes. There was a rental book market of graphic novels in the 1700s in Japan. Effectively graphic novels. If you page through them, it's art like this by Utagawa, I believe, or Hokusai was another artist who did these famous iconic images. These are woodblock prints, and they actually made their way eventually to Europe and changed European painting forever by bringing some Japanese cultural influence into that stream. At the same time, these are early 1800s. I guess by the mid 1800s, we have the rental book markets, the graphic novels of the 1700s that I mentioned, had advanced to the point where they were telling full graphic novel stories of the history of America. This makes me wish I could read Japanese, because this one is called George Washington Defending His Wife Carol, and there's a lot going on in this artwork. This is called John Adams versus the Snake. I believe it's metaphorical, but maybe there's somewhere in American history, there's a story of a gigantic snake. Or maybe it's the artist, the cartoonist, this 1860s Japanese cartoonist being fanciful with his history. By the 20th century, these techniques are being used in propaganda posters. This is from the Russo-Japanese War, telling stories and communicating events from the war and heroes of the Japanese military. And then by the 1920s or 30s, a lot of these techniques have become the kamishibai storytelling techniques. And the kamishibai man, he comes with his bike, he sets up his stage, and he tells stories on the street corners and pulls cards out to reveal the next image. Well, it's a very short step from that kind of artwork into turning pages in manga a few decades later. And a lot of the later kamishibai storytellers and painters actually found work making, I'm going to jump ahead through a few of these kamishibai, making the print manga, of which Nausicaa is my 1980s example. So when we look at Captain Carrot and his amazing zoo crew, we're looking at probably comics traditions that stretch back through comic books and comic strips, a lot of which people mentioned in the Q&A at the start tonight, back into the early 20th century newspaper industry. When we're reading manga like Hayao Miyazaki's Nausicaa, even though it comes from the same time, it's stretching back. Some of its precursors are kamishibai storytellers, or some of those landscape painters or woodblock print artists. And they have a really different approach to building that page of comics there. So those are some of the influences that make these comics so different around the world. And I see that we're getting close to 8 o'clock. Do we have any more questions or comments, Laura, that we want to pop in with?
At the moment, we have a comment by Patri Nicholas. Japanese prints always blow my mind by the stories they tell. And then Patri also says, what about the Stations of the Cross?
I was just thinking of that last night, Patri. For my last example, I'm going to share a personal example. I will jump ahead. I have early newspaper strips, Superman, World War II comics, leading up to civil rights comics. I'm going to jump ahead to a book I did about 10 years ago. I went to Eastern Slovakia and lived with my grandmother's cousin. And I hadn't made the connection between religion and comics yet, but I was starting to see all the stained glass windows in the churches. And I went into this little chapel in the village my great-grandmother was from. And they have an altar there that is a winged altar that opens up. Actually, it closes one night a year on Easter Eve. It closes up and you see these saints and you commune with these saints. Each one is like a cover of a comic book to me, because there are hints of these stories here. And then when you open it up, you get a narrative from panel to panel that you're meant to read. And I spent a lot of time in front of this asking people to tell me the stories, and everybody told the stories in a different way, but the artwork kind of guided them through those stories. And then you mentioned the Stations of the Cross. Of course, that's part of a cathedral, any cathedral. But if you go out of this chapel and walk up the hill out of town, there's a little, it's called the Path of the Cross. And there are little stations. There are 14, I think, in this one. And as you walk up the hill, it gives you a little poem and a picture to contemplate as that walks you along up to the crucifixion at the top of the hill. And there's a cross at the top of the hill. And that to me is my great-grandmother would have been in this church worshiping, singing, praying to comics in the altars. And then you come out of the church now and you go up the hill and you're walking through a comic that moves you through space and guides you through a story. And that living in that community really drove home to me and got me started thinking about this bigger definition of comics, of how we as humans have used images and words together for at least 44,000 years or tens of thousands of years. We've used images to communicate and to share stories and information and ideas. And we're still doing it, and we're learning from each other faster and faster. So that's the last piece I was going to say tonight is I hope that, having looked at a couple of these comics from around the world, and this really is a tiny, tiny sampling of ones that I happen to like, I hope you go out tonight and notice something else. When you're in a public restroom and you see those little pictures showing you how to wash your hands, maybe those are comics. Notice where images are being used in sequence, maybe with text or maybe not. And let's see if we can find some other kinds of comics, some new comics that nobody's noticed yet out there, because I think they're out there and we're making them.
All right. Well, Liz says that this that you were just talking about makes her think of the baptistry doors in Florence.
Yes, right. And those are doors with, I don't have pictures of them, but they have lots of little panels, right? And it tells a story. I got interested in this type of stuff where I was looking at icons originally in Eastern Slovakia, and the Rusinski churches there are more Eastern Orthodox, and they have these wonderful icon paintings that really tell stories panel to panel around a big central image. And I think that's what you see in those Florentine baptistry doors too. And in a lot of cathedral architecture, they just filled every spare space in some of those cathedrals with carved, painted stories. And they didn't assume people could read anything. They told it all in pictures. And that's very deliberate on the church's part. There's a specific, somebody, medievalist who came to this presentation once, mentioned that there was a specific conference in the Catholic Church where they said, hey folks, let's do stories and pictures because people can't read and we got to get the stories out to them. So it's wonderful, wonderful propaganda, wonderful storytelling for the powerful. Also, I want to encourage everybody to take a sticky note or take a notepad and try doodling a couple comics yourself. And you'll see that it's also wonderful, a wonderful art form for those of us who are not so powerful to try our hand at to communicate.
We have a question. What is the image that you just had us on? Can you?
This icon painting?
Yeah.
This is St. Nicholas, circa 1600s, from the Russian Icon Museum down in Massachusetts. I did a program there last year in the summer of 2020, where we looked at icons and then we built icons based on family stories. So we took an ancestor or someone very important to you, and we created an image of them and then built a story in panels around them. And the point that I was really floored by was when you look at these icon paintings from all around Asia and Europe and the Middle East, or even they have some icon paintings. This one's from Ethiopia. It's from a much more recent 1900s icon painter in Ethiopia. And then you come back to some of the artwork we were seeing in the summer of 2020. I suddenly felt I could understand it a little better when I realized, oh, maybe this is drawing on a lot of different artistic traditions, but to my eye, it has a sense of iconism and martyrdom, along with African artwork and community-based modern art and trading cards. There's so many different art forms happening here. And that's the point I like to make, that cartoonists, because we purposefully draw as simply as possible, we can mix and match lots of styles and bring things into places where fine arts or slower arts maybe can't keep up. So keep your eyes out and you might see, if not comics influenced artwork pretty much everywhere nowadays. And Yeah, I just realized these are also martyrs with halos, right? Who are on this altar in Slovakia. Not iconism, but similar. Yeah, so keep your eyes out as we're out there. And I bet you'll find some more comics in world history and cultures. Oh, last thing I should mention before I go, let me stop this screen share and quickly flash my website up, because I have learned it's best to show people. Oops, where's my website here? Let me open this up. It's best to show people this so that you've seen it. Sorry. Okay, merrickbennett.com. I would pass out little mini comics with my website on it if we were in person tonight. And the other thing I wanted to point out is I will put this link into the Q&A right now. It is the Humanities to Go audience survey for online programs. And if you wouldn't mind clicking over, or at least grabbing the URL, you can give, oh, I'm sorry. I can't put something into the Q&A, but maybe Laura, if you can share that with our participants, you can give New Hampshire Humanities some feedback on tonight's presentation.
Our participants tonight should be led directly to this survey as they close out, hopefully.
Great. Okay, I just didn't want to forget that. When we do our Civil War folk music presentation, we always say, we're going to play one more tune, fill out the feedback form as we play it, but I won't do that tonight. But I wanted to point out on merrickbennett.com, you can go under Comics Workshop. There is a page called Recommended Reading List. And all the stuff that I've shown you tonight is, most of it is not my own travel snapshots. It's stuff I've researched on the web and grabbed from other people's websites. So thank you, hats off to the internet. But on that recommended reading page, if you go down, you'll see some buttons. And if you want to see more about Asia, or specifically Japanese manga, comics in Europe, and comics in World War II, the Middle East, there's a couple more comic strips, history. By no means exhaustive resource lists. And I would love to hear from you also if there's stuff that you don't see there that you want me to go look around and poke around in. I'm always interested to know what people are interested in. And I'm happy to go hunt down some sources and post them on my website, because then other people can find them too. So please check it out, and feel free to contact me too if you find some comics you want to share. I'm always glad to hear from people after these presentations.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And the rest of the comments are all saying thank you very much. This is fascinating. And we really appreciate you taking the time tonight. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. And thank you, Exeter Historical, for hosting. And thank you, New Hampshire Humanities, for making this possible.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Good night, everybody.